The morning my father died, my brother was already on the phone with a real estate agent. I didn't find out until 3 days later when a woman named Cynthia from RE/Max called the house landline asking to schedule a walkthrough. I was standing in the kitchen in my dad's old flannel shirt, the one that still smelled like his woodshop, eating cereal I didn't taste. I told her she had the wrong number. She read back the address. She did not have the wrong number. My brother, Trevor, had called her the same afternoon our father passed. I should back up. My name is Nora. I'm 31 years old, and I grew up in a 2-story house in Guelph, Ontario. The kind of neighborhood where people still leave their garage doors open on summer evenings and wave at each other across the lawn. My parents, my dad, Robert, and my mom, Claire, bought that house before Trevor was born. They lived there for 34 years. My dad built the garden shed in the backyard himself, board by board. My mom planted the same tulip bulbs every October for decades. That house wasn't just property. It was the whole shape of our childhood. But I need to say something else first because it matters to everything that happened after. I was adopted. My parents never made it a secret, not exactly, but they never sat me down and explained it either. It was just something I absorbed growing up, the way you absorb that some families eat dinner at 6 and some eat at 8. I knew I'd come to them through the Children's Aid Society when I was 14 months old. I knew my mom had a difficult pregnancy with Trevor and the doctors had advised against a second. I knew they had chosen me, which my mom always said with a kind of quiet fierceness, like the choosing mattered more than anything biological ever could. Trevor was 3 years older than me. We were close when we were small. I have a photograph of us in matching Halloween costumes, him a pirate, me a pumpkin, grinning at the camera on the front steps. I don't know when things shifted. Somewhere in our teens, I think. He started saying things under his breath, little comments. You don't actually look like either of them. You know Dad's eyes are blue, right? I brushed them off as sibling cruelty. I thought it was just Trevor being Trevor. When I was 22, he told me flat out at Christmas dinner in front of my aunt and 2 cousins that I had no biological claim to anything in that house. My mom went pale. My dad put his fork down very slowly. Neither of them said much, and I think I laughed it off at the time, the way you do when something hurts too much to acknowledge in the moment. But the words lodged somewhere in my chest and stayed there. My parents died 11 days apart. My dad had a massive stroke on a Tuesday morning in early March. He never regained consciousness. My mom, who had been his primary caregiver through his decline over the previous 2 years, was hospitalized the week after the funeral with what the doctors described as acute cardiac stress. She died on a Friday. The grief counselor at the hospital told me that sometimes happens with long married couples, that the body just follows. I was 29 years old and both my parents were gone in less than 2 weeks. I flew back from Vancouver, where I'd been living and working as a dental hygienist. I took bereavement leave and then I took unpaid leave and then I called my manager and told her I didn't know when I was coming back. She was kind about it. I stayed in the Guelph house because I couldn't imagine being anywhere else. Trevor arrived the day of our dad's funeral with his wife Steph and their 2 kids. He stayed in a hotel. He said it was because the kids slept better in hotels. But I noticed he never once offered to stay at the house, never came over in the evenings, never sat with me in the kitchen the way we used to sit as teenagers. The night after my mom's funeral, I came downstairs at 2 in the morning because I couldn't sleep. Trevor was sitting at the kitchen table in the dark. I almost didn't see him. He had his phone face down in front of him, and he was just sitting there, still. He looked up at me and something moved across his face, something I couldn't read. We need to talk about the house, he said. I sat down across from him. I was exhausted in a way that went past tired, past sad, into something almost calm. I thought we were going to have a practical conversation. Probate, lawyer, what to keep and what to donate. I thought we were going to do this like adults. He said the house was his, not ours, his. I stared at him. He spoke carefully like he'd been rehearsing, which I think he had. He said that biologically, legally, I was not their child, the way he was. He said the adoption had been informal, that there was no updated will, that he had spoken to someone, he didn't say who had confirmed he was the sole biological heir. He said he wasn't trying to be cruel, but he thought I should know where things stood before I got too comfortable. I asked him what he meant by too comfortable. He said he'd already been in touch with a realtor, that the house would need to go on the market, probably by May, to catch the spring listings. That he understood this was hard timing and he was willing to give me 60 days to find somewhere else. I sat there and I looked at my brother across the table in the house where we both grew up, in the kitchen where my mom made us pancakes every Saturday, and I felt something go very quiet inside me. I said, okay. He seemed thrown by that. He'd expected tears or yelling. I could see it in his face. Okay, he said. Good night, Trevor, I said, and I went back upstairs. I didn't sleep. I lay in my old bedroom and looked at the ceiling and thought about a lot of things. I thought about the fact that my parents had never, not once in 30 years, made me feel less than fully theirs. I thought about my mom calling me from the hospital last December to tell me she'd updated her paperwork just to be safe because her health had been declining. I thought about the way she'd said it. Not upset, just practical, her voice steady. I thought about how she'd asked me the name of the family lawyer, the one who'd helped them with their estate years ago, and I'd looked it up and texted her the number while she was still on the phone. I thought about that conversation for a long time in the dark. In the morning, I called the lawyer. His name was Frank Okafor, and he'd been my parents' solicitor for nearly 15 years. He had a small practice on Woolwich Street, the kind of office with wood paneling and a receptionist who offered you tea. I'd met him once, years ago, at some neighborhood event. I remembered he had a calm, unhurried way of speaking that made everything feel slightly less catastrophic. I told him what Trevor had said. I told him about the realtor. There was a pause, then he said, Nora, I need you to come in. I went in that afternoon. I won't pretend I wasn't scared. I drove the 15 minutes from the house to his office, with the heat on high even though it wasn't cold, my hands too tight on the wheel. I had built a small story in my mind on the drive over, a worst-case narrative where Trevor was right and I had nothing, and I would have to start over in some apartment in a city I'd half left already. And I kept testing the weight of that story to see if I could survive it. I think I could have. I want to say that. What my parents gave me wasn't contingent on a house. But here is what Frank Okafor told me when I sat across from his desk. My parents had updated their will 14 months ago. Both of them together in this office, with Frank as their solicitor and a second witness. They had structured the estate as a trust. The house, their savings, my dad's registered retirement income, everything held in trust and to be transferred to me upon both their deaths. The document was precise, notarized, and completely legal. Trevor received one thing, a letter. I asked Frank if I could read it. He handed me a copy. My dad had written most of it in the slightly formal way he wrote things when he wanted them to be serious. He said they had made this decision together and without hesitation. He said they knew Trevor might not understand and that they were sorry for that. Genuinely sorry. He said that Nora had always been their daughter in every way that mattered, and that the ways that mattered were the only ones they'd ever counted. He also said something else. He said they had become aware over the past several years of certain actions Trevor had taken that had affected their financial situation, and that this too had informed their decision. I looked up at Frank. He let me sit with it for a moment before he continued. My parents had discovered, 18 months before my father's stroke, that Trevor had been making unauthorized transfers from a joint account they'd set up with him for household emergencies, money meant for repairs, medication, unexpected costs. Over 4 years, the total came to just over $92,000. My dad had a brokerage account he'd contributed to for decades, modest by some measures but significant to them. Trevor had called the brokerage twice, posing as my father, to request information on liquidating assets. The second time, the rep had flagged the call as suspicious. My father, alerted by the brokerage, had investigated quietly. He had documentation, he had records, he had given them all to Frank with instructions to hand them to me. I sat in that office for a long time. Frank poured me tea I didn't ask for and let me just sit there. Outside the window, Village Street was doing ordinary afternoon things. A woman walked a dog. A car idled at a light. The world was completely indifferent to the fact that my understanding of the last several years had just rearranged itself. I thought about the emergency repairs my parents kept mentioning and then saying they'd sorted out. I thought about the trip to Portugal they'd cancelled 2 years ago because of unexpected expenses. I thought about my mom in her last few years, clipping grocery coupons when I knew she'd never had to before. I thought about Trevor's renovated kitchen in his house in Oakville. The new truck. I drove home. I sat in the driveway and I cried for a while, not for me, but for my parents. For the fact that they had carried this quietly. For the fact that they had still loved him through it. Still written him a letter that started with, "We are genuinely sorry." For the fact that they had protected me anyway, even while they were protecting him from his own worst choices by not pressing charges. I didn't cry about the house. The house had never been in question, not really. I think some part of me had known that, even in the dark at 2 in the morning. The next day, I called Trevor. He answered on the second ring, cheerful in the way people are when they think they've already won. I told him I'd met with Frank Okafor. I told him there was a will, a trust, a notarized document, everything in order. I told him the house and the estate were mine, as our parents had intended. The silence on his end lasted a long time. When he spoke again, he wasn't cheerful. He said it wasn't fair. He said I'd manipulated our parents. He said I'd always been the favorite, that they'd felt guilty for choosing me, that this was all some overcorrection. His voice got louder. He said he was going to contest it. I said he was welcome to consult a lawyer. He did. He hired someone, sent a formal letter, contested the will on the grounds of, I think the argument was undue influence. The idea that I had somehow coerced elderly and unwell people into cutting out their biological son. The lawyer Frank referred me to, a woman named Beatrice Chen, who practiced family and estate law in Kitchener, told me the case had essentially no merit. My parents had been of sound mind 14 months ago. The documents were clean. Trevor had no evidence because there was no evidence. What he had was anger and a theory. The process took 4 months. It was not pleasant. Steph stopped responding to my messages. My aunt, who I'd always been close to, called me twice, clearly having heard Trevor's version, her voice careful and searching. I told her the facts simply and without editorializing. She called back a week later and apologized. She'd spoken to Frank directly. The 2 cousins who had initially told Steph they believed Trevor eventually came to me separately. First my cousin Amber and then her brother Kai, both of them awkward and sorry, saying they hadn't understood the full situation. I didn't hold it against them. People choose the story that's easier to hold, and Trevor's story, on the surface, had a shape that was easy to feel sorry for. Biological son, excluded from his parents' estate. It sounds terrible if you don't know the rest of it. In September, Trevor's lawyer withdrew the contest. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be clear about that. I felt tired and relieved and sad in a way that had nothing to do with the outcome of any legal proceeding. I had lost both my parents in 11 days. I had spent 4 months navigating the bureaucratic and legal aftermath while still grieving. I was living in my childhood home, surrounded by their things, eating dinner at their kitchen table, walking past my dad's woodshop every morning. The victory, if it was one, had a hollow center, but I want to tell you what I did, because this part matters to me. I spoke to Frank about the documentation my father had left, the records of the unauthorized transfers, the flagged brokerage calls, all of it. I asked him what my options were. He explained them carefully. What Trevor had done was serious. There were grounds for a civil claim at minimum. Criminal fraud is a high bar, but the evidence was documented and clean. I decided not to pursue charges. This is the part that people sometimes push back on when I tell this story, and I understand why. He took money from two people who loved him. He manipulated them. He tried to take the house. He didn't deserve to walk away without consequence. But here is what I kept thinking about. My dad wrote that they were genuinely sorry. He was a man who chose his words. He meant it. They had made peace with not pressing charges while they were alive, and they'd chosen to tell me through Frank rather than require me to act on it. I think they were leaving it to me. I think they trusted me to know what to do with the weight of it. I transferred the house into my name. I took 6 weeks off from everything and I sorted through my parents' belongings slowly, carefully, keeping far more than I probably should have, and donating the rest to a thrift shop in town that my mom used to volunteer at on Saturdays. I found the shoebox in the back of their closet with every school photo I'd ever taken. Even the bad ones, even the one from grade 7 where I'd cut my own hair the week before. I found a birthday card from my 10th birthday in my dad's handwriting that said, "Happy birthday to our Nora," the best thing that ever surprised us. In November, I called a financial advisor and a lawyer and I established the Claire and Robert Ashworth Bursary at the University of Guelph, directed towards students in financial need in the sciences, because my mom had loved science and always wished she'd gone further with it. I made the initial contribution from the trust. I wanted something living to exist from what they'd left me. I went back to Vancouver in January. I kept the house. I rent it to a family now, a couple with 2 small children who send me photos sometimes of the garden. They asked if they could plant a vegetable bed along the south-facing fence, and I said yes immediately. My mom would have liked that. I don't talk to Trevor. I don't know if I ever will. There's a version of the future where we find our to something. A phone call, a careful lunch somewhere neutral, some acknowledgement that we grew up in the same house and loved the same people even if we lost each other somewhere along the way. I hold that version loosely. I don't need it to be okay. The last time I saw him was at the grocery store near my aunt's place, last summer. I was visiting for a week. He was at the far end of the produce aisle with a basket over his arm. We made eye contact. Neither of us moved toward the other. After a moment, he turned and walked the other way. I stood there for a second, and then I put a bag of peaches in my cart and kept going. My parents chose me. They chose me carefully and on purpose, and they never once let me doubt it. Not really. Not in any way that mattered. That's not nothing. That's not even close to nothing. That's everything. I think about Trevor a lot, actually. Not with anger anymore, that burned off somewhere around month 3 of the legal process, but with something more like a tired kind of understanding. He made choices. Each one followed from the last. He took money from 2 people who trusted him, then told himself a story about why he deserved it, and then, when they were barely in the ground, he tried to take the rest. That's not a mystery. That's just what happens when someone spends years feeding the part of themselves that takes instead of the part that gives. The consequences weren't punishment handed down from anywhere outside him. They were just the shape of what he'd built. What my parents did. The quiet updating of the will, the careful documentation, the letter they left. That was also the shape of what they'd built. 30 years of choosing integrity even when it was inconvenient. My dad didn't confront Trevor dramatically. He didn't cut him off in a fury. He gathered facts, spoke to Frank, wrote a letter that started with "We are genuinely sorry," and made sure I was protected without requiring me to go to war over it. That took a kind of wisdom I don't think I fully appreciated until I was sitting across from Frank's desk reading it, knowing what's right and actually doing the quiet, unglamorous work of it. That's harder than it looks. I won't pretend I handled everything perfectly either. There were weeks where I was not graceful about any of it. I said things to my aunt on the phone that were sharper than they needed to be. I let the stress of the legal process make me smaller for a while, more defensive, less like myself. What pulled me back every time was the question of what I actually wanted to build with what I'd been left, not just the estate. The example. My parents had shown me something. It seemed like a waste to respond to it with bitterness. The decision not to pursue charges against Trevor was the hardest thing I did in all of it, and also, I think, the most important. Not because he deserved mercy. I'm genuinely not sure about that, but because I knew that if I pushed it, I would spend the next several years of my life in that wound instead of moving through it. I had a choice about what to carry. That felt like its own kind of strength. Not the loud kind, the kind that doesn't require anyone to witness it. I established the bursary in November. I sat in my parents' kitchen the morning after I signed the paperwork, and I drank my coffee and I looked out at the backyard, the bare November garden, the old shed my dad built still standing at the far end of the yard. I thought, this is what you do with what you're given. You make something from it that outlasts the hard parts. Nora grew up in that house. She learned something there that no legal contest could touch. That's the part Trevor never understood and maybe never will. That what her parents gave her wasn't an asset. It was a way of being in the world. And you can't contest that. You can't transfer it. You can't take it in the night from a joint account. It just lives in you, quietly, and you carry it forward.